So welcome everybody to UNIT Masters live speaker sessions. Today we have with us Jonathan Galea from Malta. Jonathan is a CEO and a founder of several projects. He's been in the crypto space since 2013, and his his consulting company provides strategic consulting to the governments of the world. In addition, he's also providing consulting services to the largest DeFi projects in the world. So any questions you may have towards decentralization and tokenization and any kinds of visionary questions of how do you see the industry, please feel free to ask him. And Jonathan will start off today with sharing his life story about how he got into crypto, and then share about some use cases he's been working on. And then we will open up to the discussions and open questions from the audience. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us today. And I hand over the microphone to you.
Yep. Thanks a lot for that here. And hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the world you're in at the moment. My name is Jonathan. I'm a lawyer by profession. And as you rightly mentioned, my main focus, let's say, career path over the past few years has been focused on the crypto industry. And in today's presentation, I just want to give, let's say, a bit of an overview, or let's say my side of the story in relation to this journey in the crypto world, and also, of course, certain important takeaways and other, let's say, bits and pieces of information about the crypto industry in general, especially in relation to the DeFi space, decentralized finance. So here comes, I guess, the boring autobiographic part, which I think is important just to give, let's say, an insider's view of what it looks like and being part of the crypto industry since relatively early days, seeing it maturing into the current, let's say, status that it's in. And of course, let's say what's next for the crypto industry in general. So, as you rightly mentioned, my journey started off in 2013. I was still doing the law course, the University of Malta. And I remember that I was building my own laptop for gaming purposes, basically, as one would do when they have any free time and when they're not studying. So while I was building my own laptop, I had to source graphics cards for my laptop, and I couldn't find the ones I wanted on eBay or any other e-commerce platform. And I tried to research it further as to why there was a shortage of graphics cards, and I came across an article that graphics cards, particularly of the AMD brand, were in shortage because they were being used by Bitcoin miners. And that was the first time I had come across the term Bitcoin. Started researching a bit about it, to see what it was all about. And I do remember clearly I came across an article by on motherboard.com, which stated that basically Bitcoin is the next gold, here's why. And after that, I was getting pretty intrigued. I must admit that at the beginning, I was mostly intrigued because I was reading that people were making money off it. So again, I'm not going to be all, let's say, idealistic and say that I got into Bitcoin straight away because I believe the fundamentals behind it. But the more I started reading about it, the more the ideas started making sense. And I do recall quite clearly that back then the price of Bitcoin was at around 170, 180 US dollars. So I said, hey, being still a student at the time, I couldn't afford Bitcoin. And I said, well, I mean, is Bitcoin the only cryptocurrency out there? So I'm researching further and came across other alternative currencies, or altcoins as they are known. And the more I started reading, the more I started becoming involved in the whole sector. And in the span of, I would say, a few weeks, I had registered up for an account on bitcointalk.org, which was the largest forum for everything crypto related at the time. Started getting heavily involved in some of the discussions taking place, and I quickly, let's say, jumped into the rabbit hole and started immersing myself fully within the crypto industry. I think around 2 months after I first came across the word Bitcoin, I had already set up my own mining rig consisting of 3 AMD graphics cards, which I finally managed to source, an aluminum frame, motherboard, CPU, and it was all good to go. Started mining altcoins, and I also started getting involved in some interesting altcoin projects. Back at the time, every altcoin project had the word coin in it, so it was basically a variant of mint coin, black coin, hunter coin, myriad coin, and all that. So again, just throw the word coin to it, and you have the next big thing coming up in the crypto space. It was a very interesting period because, first of all, as I said, all discussions were taking place on bitcoin.org or on MIRC. So again, it was, let's say, a very small community. No one knew each other, but we were all, of course, very enthusiastic about the space and trying to contribute to it as much as possible. In February 2014, we experienced the first, let's say, severe crypto winter. This was basically the time when Mt. Gox, which was the largest crypto exchange back then, halted all deposits and withdrawals from its exchange, and the price of Bitcoin tumbled from around $1,200 to around $200 and stayed at that price range for a number of months, even years. And at the time, I said, well, it seems that, let's say, interest in the crypto space is, let's say, decreasing a bit, but let me continue doing research in relation to the space and, of course, getting to know more about it. I completed the course in programming as well, in the C language, which is, let's say, the mother of most modern languages, in order to understand, let's say, how programming languages work, which is different than natural languages. And also in that same year, in 2014, I started researching for my thesis subject, which was the effect of Bitcoin on money laundering legislation. The more I read about it, the more I was convinced that, contrary to what, let's say, the naysayers were stating out there, cryptocurrencies were here, they were here to stay. And if the regulators would just, let's say, take just a bit of time to understand them, they would realize that this is something which can actually help them in combating crime due to the presence of open public ledgers backing most cryptocurrencies or most of the major ones. And in fact, that was the conclusion I reached in my thesis in May 2015, when I completed it and submitted it to the board at the Faculty of Laws of the University of Malta. That was not the end of my journey in the crypto space, although for the following 2 years, I, let's say, distanced myself slightly from the industry, that I wasn't reading about it 12 hours a day, but rather I kept on following developments and took up a job within the remote gaming industry, the remote gambling industry, which is quite prominent here in Malta. I do recall as well, and this might be, let's say, a bit of an interesting episode, that following the submission of my thesis, completing my Doctorate of Laws course, I was looking for a job, and one of the interviews was with a smallish, mid-sized band, let's say that, by Maltese standards here in Malta. And I do recall quite clearly that in the first interview, they had asked me, what would you see yourself doing in 5 years' time? And I had said, well, I would hopefully have, let's say, a more prominent role in relation to the crypto sector. And I hope that the bank, of course, would, let's say, be looking with interest at this particular emerging sector. The reply I got was that, listen, we don't deal with fantasy currencies here. If that's what you're looking for, then again, you might not, let's say, find your place here. And we just deal with, let's say, concrete, substantial stuff here at the bank. I said, well, okay, fine, I understand. And I received an offer. A few weeks later, they basically gave me a low-ball offer, and I politely declined it. And that was the end of the story with this particular bank. It was, let's say, one of the many rejections I had at the time when, let's say, the crypto sector was being looked upon quite unfavorably. It was at the time where, let's say, Bitcoin was struggling to emerge from the shadow of the Mt. Gox incident, and also the crypto sector in general was, let's say, relatively unknown to the wider world. It still is, but back then it was, let's say, even more obscure. In 2017, in January 2017, I noticed some very interesting signs in the crypto market emerging. By interesting signs, I mean that the media started to pick up on certain, let's say, crypto-related stories. I consider the price movements of certain currencies, including major ones like Bitcoin, were, let's say, showing some very promising signs. And I said, well, let me go back to full immersion mode within the crypto sector. And that's what I did. I noticed that while the price movement of cryptocurrencies was pretty much stagnant over the years between 2014 and 2017, there were a lot of interesting developments taking place, and quietly the crypto ecosystem kept on building itself throughout those 3 years. It was at that same time, I think somewhere around March 2017, that the famous ICO boom started taking prominence at quite a rapid pace. And after the ICO boom started, I think, becoming very prominent, end of March, beginning of April of that year, I could see that, hey, this time around, things are different. We're not talking anymore about, let's say, a few obscure or outright shady crypto projects being created by anonymous developers with questionable motives. And sure enough, there were a lot of scams taking place in 2013, 2014. This time around, there were still scams taking place, but projects were actually being structured in such a way that they were proposing real-world utility, something which was not present in the previous years. And the golden era of ICOs, initial coin offerings, took place between April of 2017 and July of 2017. People will tell you that initial coin offerings, let's say, were a bit of a bubble, and it extended until 2018, which is true, but initial coin offerings were truly successful in those 3 months, because I remember every single ICO taking place under the sun in those 3 months was raising insane amounts of capital, with nothing else than a white paper presented with some fancy graphics, a team which claims they might have been before, even just for an internship or something, they were being taken very seriously, and they were raising, let's say, amounts which were rarely less than 10 million worth of crypto in US dollars. And it was at this time that I started saying, hey, if these ICOs are raising these funds and people are just blindly trusting these, let's say, teams, these token teams, what happens after they start working on the project? They raise the funds, where next? And there were two main questions to be answered. First of all, what kind of responsibility do these persons have when they raise the funds? And how are they managing the funds? Secondly, what are the legal implications for raising such funds in such a manner? And what are the legal obligations of the fundraisers versus the persons that have invested in the project? So I started, let's say, doing some homework on whether there is a need for such token teams to, let's say, be given regulatory advice on how to deal with the funds raised and, of course, the building of the project. And it was only in September of that same year that I decided to take the plunge and start actively working on setting up my own business, which would provide regulatory and legal services as well as advice to, let's say, token teams back then raising funds through ICOs. I started publishing some articles, and I was shortly thereafter approached by representatives from the, okay, we have a message, seems that there is some issue with the sound. Let me try and move a bit closer, maybe it helps a bit, be the microphone. Is this better, Miguel? Anyone else experiencing sound issues? Yep.
Now it's better that you're closer.
Okay. I think it might be proximity, so let me just move a bit closer. It's a bit better. And it was at that same time, that year, that I was approached by representatives from the government of Malta and the Malta Financial Services Authority to assist them with the structure of the framework that would regulate issuers of tokens and also service providers. So Bitly Solutions, which is the company that I have founded and I am the CEO of, started off on two main binaries. First of all, offering advisory services to token issuers, raising funds through ICOs, and also offering advisory services to the government of Malta and the MFSA. From then on, I think it was a bit of a, let's say, wild roller coaster ride, because we were initially, let's say, starting off in no man's land in terms of, let's say, finding clients to offer our services, as well as working on a legal framework, the likes of which had not been enacted before. Malta has been the first country in the world to enact such a comprehensive regulatory framework. And in the span of a few months, we had various clients looking to raise funds through ICOs. Word was picking up out there that Malta was working on a comprehensive framework which would regulate the industry at large. And all of a sudden, from a team of 2 people, we suddenly became a team of 6 people and working full-time and solely focusing on the crypto industry. All of this, I think, came to, let's say, at a high point on the 1st of November 2018, when Malta's legal framework was officially announced by myself at the Malta Blockchain Summit. And it was, let's say, well met, very well met by the industry at large, where I think the birth of the so-called blockchain island took place at the time, and people started flocking to Malta in order to apply for a license with the MFSA. At that same conference, I remember persons from the government of Serbia approaching me and asking me whether I would be interested in offering them regulatory consultancy in relation to blockchain crypto, which I happily took up, and it was my second, let's say, role as an advisor to a government in relation to blockchain and cryptocurrencies. And shortly after that as well, I also worked with the Japanese Financial Services Authority to provide them advice in relation to their Payment Services Act and how ICOs would fall under that same act as well. All this, I think, made me realize that what started off as a, let's say, almost annoyed research exercise about Bitcoin and why these Bitcoin miners were, let's say, making my beloved graphics cards unavailable for purchase, it steamrolled into something that, let's say, became my passion and my, let's say, main career focus or sole career focus rather at this point in time. And nowadays, the crypto industry has, let's say, become, I would say, a giant in my eyes, even though it might, let's say, pale in comparison to certain other industries or assets like gold or the stock market and stock markets in the US and all that. But keep in mind that when I had entered or became aware of the crypto industry, the market cap was just a few millions. And nowadays we're talking about a total market cap of over 1.5 trillion US dollars. All in the span of 8 years or so. So to me, watching this growth taking place is still something that pretty much, let's say, makes me almost, let's say, stare at disbelief in the screen whenever I see, of course, all the interest that's being generated in relation to the crypto space. And I would like to go back to the point at the very beginning of my, let's say, rambling, where I said that initially I was interested in the crypto space because of, let's say, the potential speculative opportunities present in this space. Over the past few years, I have, of course, learned that this is not just about speculation. It's not another get-rich-quick scheme. And along the years, there have been various efforts by, let's say, persons trying to propose the use of blockchain technology for other areas, which is potentially possible, but no other use case is nowhere near as strong as that of crypto when it comes to use of blockchain technology. And also the potential disruption that crypto brings around to various industries, especially, of course, industries relating to the financial world. As you are aware, banks in the US have finally woken up and started, let's say, offering services in relation to Bitcoin for now, which by far remains the biggest cryptocurrency by market cap and also adoption rate. Various countries around the world have now regulated the provision of services in relation to crypto and also the issuance of tokens. We ourselves, we do not only offer services in Malta and just Malta anymore, but we have also expanded our service offering to Liechtenstein, Singapore, and soon as well in the upcoming months to Switzerland. And we are also aware of various efforts taking place by other countries yet that have not jumped onto the bandwagon, who are also intending on regulating this space. So I think in 2 years' time, most of the countries around the world would have some form of regulatory framework targeting the crypto space, which is insane considering that around 5 years ago, most countries were even considering banning cryptocurrencies, and all this has, let's say, made a massive U-turn in the past 5 years. Apart from disruption that certain assets like Bitcoin bring around, I think one of the major disruptive events we have witnessed and are still yet to witness in, let's say, in its full glory, relates to decentralized finance. Blockchain technology is, let's say, often not advertised, but rather commented upon as being, let's say, disintermediating technology, which is true. But I think up until now, very few people have actually understood what, let's say, the effects of disintermediation really are. The best case so far, up until the advent of DeFi, was Bitcoin itself, whereby you could, let's say, send Bitcoin to anywhere around the world in the span of a few minutes and at minimum transaction fees. But then again, there was always the counter argument, although I don't really agree with it, that transactions using, let's say, the Visa network, for example, takes a shorter time than Bitcoin, and the fees are, let's say, quite reasonable, although still quite high when compared to Bitcoin. Again, that argument fails in comparison to what Bitcoin can actually do and can actually present in terms of benefits. But let's say that was a plausible counter argument. With DeFi, with decentralized finance, that argument is completely thrown out of the window, because there is no comparison to centralized service providers such as banks in terms of, let's say, the opportunities that DeFi brings along. Take the example of peer-to-peer loan platforms, which are mostly, let's say, built on the Ethereum blockchain. If you want a loan, you typically have to, first of all, undergo an extensive due diligence process with the bank, who would ask you even for the name of your last 10 pets, if they could. And you also have to, let's say, undergo a lengthy process, apart from the due diligence process itself, in terms of, let's say, explaining why you would need the loan and how you're aiming to repay it back, and what's your financial standing and all that. And I would say that most people perhaps here on the call have at some point or another applied for a loan with a bank. Now, imagine if you could obtain a loan using collateral that, first of all, does not need to be collateral in terms of traditional assets as expected by the bank, such as the property itself. Secondly, the loan itself would be subject to extremely low interest rates. Thirdly, you would be rewarded for taking a loan out of a particular, let's say, platform. So not only do you pay very low interest rates and you're not questioned about the loan that you're taking out, but you also get rewarded for taking out that loan itself. This is something that is enabled by, let's say, some of the most prominent peer-to-peer loan platforms built on Ethereum, and these are just one of the subsets of the whole DeFi protocol. DeFi essentially stands for decentralized finance, as I just stated, and DeFi is not only about peer-to-peer loan platforms. We're seeing amazing products being built on the Ethereum blockchain and those other blockchains. There are certain products like, for example, the so-called yield farming products, whereby you provide liquidity to a particular DeFi-based protocol, and you get a high interest rate in return for providing liquidity to such protocols. And by high interest rates, sometimes such interest rates could be, for example, even up to 1% daily in terms of your invested or staked amount. I'm mentioning these percentages because I often get asked, but all this sounds like a Ponzi scheme. I mean, how am I given a rate of return which is that high and this doesn't make it a Ponzi scheme? First of all, the rates of return are not fixed or guaranteed. And that is one of the sure tail signs of a Ponzi scheme, whereby they guarantee you a rate of return, let's say on a weekly or monthly basis. Secondly, you need to appreciate how these DeFi platforms operate, whereby with the removal of the intermediaries, which are taking significant cuts of, let's say, any amount deposited with a particular institution, as is the case of centralized service providers like banks, here we are cutting out the middleman and having the platform being operated solely through code and by code. And the removal of these intermediaries leads to a more efficient experience, faster, cheaper, and overall, let's say, much more involving than anything that has been devised by the centralized finance industry at this moment in time. I must comment that basically, when it comes to saying the words decentralized and the centralized, I have to be very careful because sometimes there's a bit of, let's say, confusion between the two. So to sum up, let's say, the topic of today, we are looking at something that, despite what you're seeing, despite the fact that the whole market is currently valuated at over 1.5 trillion US dollars, we are still very much at the beginning. You can either, let's say, take a fancy to Bitcoin as an alternative asset to other established assets like gold. You might look at it as a store of value. You might look at it as, let's say, a symbol of financial freedom. You can look at DeFi products as something which is alternative to your, let's say, savings account with your favorite bank. You might look at DeFi as the next disruptor, the next major disruptor for the finance industry. Or you might look at DeFi as something which is, let's say, a passing fad in your eyes. What I can say for sure is that we are very much at the verge of, let's say, an overhaul of most systems that we have become accustomed to over the past decades. And although, let's say, some people might say that COVID is, let's say, a disaster that has happened to the world at large, and it's a statement I fully agree with, I think it's also something that has pushed the reset button on quite a few things that we were, let's say, accustomed to, and we're not even noticing anymore. And it's serving as an enabler rather than just as a disruptor. And my last takeaway, and I will conclude my monologue and open up to questions from the audience, is that if you find something that you're passionate about, make it your main and sole focus. And no matter what one might say, no matter how many times you might be rejected, I mentioned the story about the bank. I also recall that the first conference that I was speaker in abroad, it was in London in 2016. I recall that I had my business card still stating I was an assistant legal counsel at the gaming company I used to work for. I gave my card to one of the attendees there. They took a look at it, told me, listen, we don't do business with assistant legal counsels, and they threw the card away from me. I mean, again, I experienced these kind of episodes various times over the past few years. But the fact that I believed, and I still fully believe, and will believe in, let's say, something that I've worked for, over the past few years always made me, let's say, look back on such episodes. Like, fine, if that's what you think, then I respect your decision. I don't respect your behavior, but I respect your decision. Off you go. I will continue on my own path. And it is that level of conviction that you need in order to succeed in those things that you truly believe in. No matter how stupid it might sound, no matter how, let's say, ridiculous it might sound in terms of whether it's achievable or not, if you truly believe in it, go for it. And sounds cliche, but I cannot give any better advice than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Just picking up on what you just said about following, enacting your vision, maybe you want to share with us what is actually your life vision?
Rather than a life vision per se, I like to call it a life mission. And I think I have two life missions in general. First of all, the obvious one is that I'd like to be, let's say, part of, let's call it an army, which disrupts the systems that we currently have in place, not for the sake of disruption itself, but rather for the sake of improving and moving or evolving to the next stage of whatever it is. In my case, it's evolving to the next stage of financial freedom and taking back what is ultimately ours, which was taken away from us over the course of many years. And people started realizing that when there were certain incidents, like, for example, the closure of the banks in Cyprus, where people couldn't withdraw their own money from the ATMs. It's their money, but they cannot withdraw it. That was one of the episodes that really angered me and encouraged me, of course, to work on this particular sector with my full soul, let's say that. The other life mission I have is a more general one, but something which I think keeps me happy at the same time. And it's a mission of empowerment, both self-empowerment and the empowerment of others. Because over the span of the last, I'm almost 30 now. Over the span of the last 29 years, I have, let's say, done a lot of things which brought me joy, sadness, success, failures, and all that. But I think the one thing that has brought me, let's say, satisfaction whenever I did it, and the full, complete sense of satisfaction, is when I commit an act which empowers others, even if it's just like a pretty meaningless act, like, let's say, congratulating someone on an achievement they have made, or maybe helping someone, let's say, find a new job or anything like that. That sense of the satisfaction you get from that empowerment is, let's say, something that has, let's say, has in a selfish way made me happy as well. But although it's, let's say, then perhaps selfish is not the right word to describe when you're empowering other people as well. So yeah, basically my two missions in life are that: disruption of the cancerous financial system that we have around us at the moment, and empowering other people in life that happen to cross my path.
Mm-hmm. Before we take up the question by Susan and open up to the entire audience, maybe a question for you to explain or share with us a use case that you have helped creating that made you feel, very happy about the work. In which way did it have an impact on society, on all the things that you care about?
One of the earliest projects I was involved in was a project by the name of Sun Contract. It's a project built by a team from Slovenia, and it was actually one of the first ICOs I had advised back in 2017. And it's a project whereby basically they were aiming to build a peer-to-peer marketplace for renewable energy resources. And this was a project which, as I said, took birth in 2017. They raised the funds they were seeking to raise, and actually built a product which is now live and has been fully operational for the past few years. And it was, let's say, a disruptive project, but more so than disruptive, it was an enabling project. Because even though the marketplace, the energy market in Slovenia was liberalized and therefore, let's say, not subject to certain constraints as present in those of monopolized energy markets, it suddenly gave a lot more freedom to normal households, common households, having a renewable energy resource and having a much more efficient means of selling their energy across the grid to other consumers of electricity. So such a project with which I was involved from the very beginning, seeing it, let's say, evolve from a concept, just an idea, all the way to a fully built and working product, I think, yes, I would pick that as one of the, let's say, highlights in terms of products that I had a hand in advising and building.
Thank you for sharing. So the question from Suzanne from our audience is, what do the latest financial action task force on money laundering consultations mean for DeFi?
I love these kind of questions. So thanks a lot for that, Suzanne. First of all, it is very, very clear that the latest draft guidelines by the FATF were a knee-jerk reaction to the DeFi industry and also the latest NFT craze, non-fungible tokens. For those maybe haven't been following, non-fungible tokens are, let's say, tokens that are unique and minted onto a blockchain, and they typically represent a particular asset, whether digital or physical. And the NFT craze currently has seen a lot of, let's say, digital artwork being sold in NFT format for silly amounts of money. I think the highest, let's say, digital artwork sold so far in terms of value was one by the artist known as Beeple, and it was sold for $69 million US. And as I said, the FATF's draft guidelines, and I must accentuate the fact that these are still draft guidelines, were a knee-jerk reaction to these particular developments. So much so that they wish to bring within the remit of the FATF, let's say, guidelines, NFTs that are used for money laundering, which begs the question, how do you classify NFTs that are, let's say, used for money laundering or NFTs that are not used for money laundering? But going back to your original question, they are trying to, of course, bring within their remit DeFi projects, particularly decentralized exchanges like Uniswap, SushiSwap, and other indexes. And if, of course, they can't put their finger on a particular legal entity which is behind these projects, they are trying to, let's say, assign responsibility to the developers behind such a project. Now, first of all, it's quite questionable as to whether such draft guidelines will be implemented in the same way that the FATF recommendations have been implemented. Because while recommendations are, let's say, more so than recommendations, but they're actually, let's say, requirements that the FATF imposes on its member countries and affiliated countries, and not implementing them would mean that such countries risk becoming grey listed. FATF guidelines are, let's say, less stringent than the recommendations themselves. I still think that most countries will implement them, but not to the same extent as recommendations, which would mean that, let's say, the famous phenomenon of forum shopping will take place. Developers will start moving to countries which have not implemented such guidelines, and therefore they would be out of reach for, let's say, not the FATF itself, which doesn't have any enforcing powers against individuals, but rather those countries which decide to implement the guidelines. But then again, if such developers are based in countries that have not implemented the guidelines, then they are out of reach. Secondly, such measures, I think, are quite short-sighted because they will only serve to drive the industry underground. And by underground, I mean that developers will simply become anonymous once again. And over the past years, we've seen some, let's say, people putting their name to projects that will start reversing itself. While the industry will continue developing, it will become, let's say, more pseudonymous or even outright anonymous, and therefore it will drive the whole, let's say, innovative sector underground. So I think that such guidelines, as I mentioned, they have been very crudely drawn up, not with enough considerations for how the industry is moving. The industry is always 2 or 3 steps ahead from the regulator. And yeah, so I think that this might be alarming news for some projects which have, let's say, put their name to what they're building, but I'm sure steps will be taken in order to, as much as possible, decentralize the structure of such projects, and secondly, also, let's say, elevate themselves from any kind of responsibility by either, let's say, leaving this in the hands of the community at large and anonymous developers, or otherwise moving to jurisdictions where they would be out of reach of the authorities. The second question I have is by Kevin. How will these financial systems be implemented in places of crisis or corruption? Do people have to work behind the curtains of the government, or it's a question of time? For example, Syria, Yemen, etc. We have seen the uptake of crypto assets like Bitcoin in countries where, let's say, the financial system is in tatters. Take, for example, the cases of Venezuela, Argentina, and certain sub-Saharan jurisdictions as well, where the uptake of Bitcoin is becoming quite notable. And I would say that it's all taking place behind the curtains of the government, as you are putting it here. The latest case that we have, one which we're observing quite closely, is India, where the government has recently announced they will be probably making certain moves to let's say, ban the trading of cryptocurrencies. We've seen it happening in the past as well in China, but I would say that so far one of the major jurisdictions involved in crypto space still remains China. So obviously, let's say the pronounced ban by the government doesn't seem to have much of an effect. And I think we'll see the same thing happening in other jurisdictions, including India, where they will make a move to let's say, ban such cryptocurrencies. I mean, at the end of the day, the whole crypto sector was built in such a way as to either exist outside applicable legal frameworks, or otherwise disrupt legal frameworks altogether. So it comes to no surprise that, let's say, such structures are flourishing in areas where they're meant to be banned, because at the end of the day, as I said earlier on, banning cryptocurrencies or DeFi products, whatever it is, you're not killing them off, you're just driving them underground, which is even worse. And welcome to them. Any further questions?
Philip, I think you had a question, right? Is that why you unmuted yourself?
No, it was something, it was a piece of business for later.
Okay, so let me continue with a question to Jonathan, which is, now we're speaking about, transforming shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism using blockchain technology. And I would love to hear your view on, what are the stakeholders who will benefit from this shift, and in which way are they benefiting from it? How would you actually explain it, for example, to people in the age of your grandparents? What is in it for them?
It's a good question. And you touched upon a point, which is a narrative that is spreading quite quickly across social media like Twitter, where there's a narrative going on about witnessing the largest transfer of wealth in human history to date. Now, I won't comment on, let's say, whether that is true or not. I have my opinion on it, but there's definitely a transfer of wealth taking place. Whether it's the greatest or not, I don't know, because I'm not a historian. But we are seeing, let's say, a shift from, let's say, money being invested in traditional assets, let's call them that, over to these new kind of assets, such as cryptocurrencies. And I think testament to that is the fact that I remember the persons, or rather the ex-chairman of the CFTC, I believe, I forgot his name, and during one of the Senate hearings, he candidly remarked that his daughter would not even hear of things like stocks in terms of, let's say, potential investment vehicles, but was asking him a lot of questions in relation to cryptocurrencies. And I think this is a clear sign that the upcoming generation is, let's say, very much interested, not only in these assets as, let's say, for the pure sake of speculation, but rather is viewing these assets as the key to financial freedom, and also as the key to what they believe in and what they stand for, which is, hey, we're young people, we're here to, let's say, usher in a new era. I'm not just talking about cryptocurrency, but a new era in general. Crypto actually represents what we believe in and what we're aiming to build in this brave new world. And I think I would explain this in very much, let's say, similar terms to my grandparents. I would start off by trying to explain that traditional financial structures, let's say, rely on us and lock away our funds in order for them to benefit. And I would bring up certain, let's say, historic events whereby, let's say, financial freedom was, let's say, taken away, whereby you can't even access your own funds. And the simplest example I can give to them is that go to a bank and try to withdraw 50,000 euro. They are yours, but you can't withdraw them. Does that symbolize financial freedom to you? And then I will go on to explain that this is moving on to a new kind of asset, whereby financial freedom is what it is. The freedom to do whatever you please with your own money at any time, any place. So yeah, that would be, I think, the way I would tackle such a subject with my grandparents.
You've already briefly touched on the definition of financial freedom for yourself. Anything you want to add to that?
Financial freedom is also, let's say, interlinked with privacy, I would say, because up until now, any semblance we had of financial freedom, even if you find a bank which, let's say, is quite flexible in how you withdraw your money or how you obtain loans, whatever it is, there is always, of course, the issue that everything you do with a bank is open, not just to you, but to pretty much, let's say, the government, the regulator, and potentially anyone else who might come across the data in legal or illegal ways. Whereas with cryptocurrencies, that is changing. And it's changing both in terms of having full control over the funds that you own, but also who actually sees what you do with your funds. And here I must, of course, state clearly that I'm in no way in favor of cryptocurrencies being used for money laundering purposes. I mean, the proceeds of crime should always be cracked down upon by the authorities. At the end of the day, crime is crime. But neither, of course, am I in favor of the narrative being, let's say, imposed onto us by certain authorities, saying that if you use cryptocurrencies, then you are a criminal because you want to remain private, or rather, they say you want to remain anonymous. And here, what I say is that, listen, being private doesn't mean that you're up to no good. It simply means that you value your own private life and, let's say, want to live your own life away from any prying eyes. And in relation to the question of whether, let's say, it's the same on the blockchain, that everything is transparent on a ledger, true. In fact, what I like to say is that the traditional financial system operates on, let's say, a principle of users known, transactions unknown. In that, if you want to interact with the traditional financial world, you need to make yourself known to the, let's say, institutions, but the transactions themselves may not always be known, whether to human error, whether because you're using cash. But when it comes to the blockchain, it's the other way around. The persons are unknown and the transactions are known. Now, if we decide to, let's say, use a gateway which links fiat to crypto, then you need to make yourself known and become fully transparent with the authorities. But at least that's your decision. Because if you decide not to, let's say, make use of fiat crypto gateways, then you can remain as private as you want. So at least there's an element of freedom involved rather than being forced to make yourself known to the authorities simply because you have to make use of your funds.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question, and then if we end our speaker session, this is from Anne, who asked, what demographic, age groups, and countries would you say are the most prominent adopters of tokenized economies? What do you say are the main barriers for adoption in this space?
I think main demographic is, let's say, first of all, people between the age of 14 to 30, 35. I think that's the main demographic we're seeing. Before, it used to be predominantly males, which were involved in the industry, but I'm happy to see that this is very quickly changing. And that I think over the past 2 years alone, there's been a significant increase in female participation in the industry, which is amazing. Countries, I would say that the Asian continent remains by far one of the, let's say, most prolific set of countries participating in the space, followed by the US, and thirdly, Europe. But I think one of the fastest growing continents in terms of crypto adoption is definitely Africa, and some of the innovation coming out of there is just amazing. And it's, let's say, a very promising sign of things to come for the crypto space. I think that the main barriers for adoption still remains education. Not education in how crypto works, but rather education in what crypto actually stands for. But once people start realizing what it actually stands for and the benefits it brings about, you don't need to understand what a hash is, or let's say how blocks are confirmed, or difference between proof of stake. All that is immaterial as long as you understand what crypto actually stands for.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think you just hit the core mission of what the UNIT Master stands for. It's actually the 6-week journey to onboard the new economy without getting too technical, but understanding the vision behind what is actually there out in the world. One wish, if you had one wish for the world, what would it be, Jonathan?
That's a bit of a tough question, but I think in order to let's say continue with the theme, I honestly don't know what to answer that question. I think I guess to continue with the theme, I can say that basically my wish is for, let's say, the world to wake up and realize that it can take back what it's rightly theirs, without asking for anyone's permission. But yeah, I think that can really very much encapsulate a lot of other things other than crypto. So yeah, that would be my wish.